Alice's house was alive with the buzz of conversation and music as people spilled between the living room and backyard. Stephanie had been excited for this party all week, talking non-stop about catching up with old friends. I wasn't as enthusiastic, but I came along anyway, wanting to support her. At first, it was fine. Small talk with a few people I vaguely remembered and some awkward laughter over Alice's attempts at telling jokes. But then I noticed him. Ryan. He was tall, smooth-talking, and standing just a little too close to Stephanie. At first, I thought I was overreacting. But then I saw the way he touched her arm when she laughed at something he said. How his gaze lingered a little too long on her. It felt wrong. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked when I managed to catch Stephanie alone for a moment. "Yeah, why wouldn't it be?" she replied, flashing me a quick smile. "You're not doing that thing again, are you?" "What thing?" "Getting all weird and possessive," she said, rolling her eyes in that way that always grated on me. "Ryan's just being friendly. Don't make this into a thing." "I'm not making it into anything," I said, though I didn't sound convincing even to myself. "I'm just saying, he seems too friendly." Stephanie sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Can you please just relax and have fun? This is why I hate bringing you to these things. You always find some reason to sulk." With that, she walked off, rejoining Ryan and Alice, leaving me standing by the snack table, clutching a drink I no longer wanted. I told myself to shake it off, but the uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger as the night wore on. As the night dragged on, I tried to focus on anything but the gnawing unease building in my chest. I wandered between groups of people, forcing polite smiles, pretending to listen to conversations that blurred together into meaningless noise. My eyes, however, kept drifting back to Stephanie. No matter where she was in the room, Ryan wasn't far away. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, it was the way she responded. I started to notice small things. When he laughed at something she said, her smile seemed brighter than usual, more alive. She leaned in slightly when they spoke, her posture casual but almost too casual, like she wanted to appear relaxed while keeping his attention. And the way her hand lingered on her drink as she nodded at his words, it felt rehearsed, almost practiced, like she wanted him to keep talking. I told myself I was imagining things. I had to be. I'd always been a little paranoid when it came to these social gatherings, where Stephanie's natural charm seemed to shine brightest. But this felt different. This wasn't just her usual outgoing nature. It felt like she was performing for him, like she cared about what he thought of her in a way that stung deeper than I cared to admit. There was a moment when I caught her glancing around the room, her eyes darting briefly toward me before she turned back to Ryan. She must have known I was watching her. She knew me well enough to know I wasn't okay with this. But instead of stepping away from him or giving me a reassuring look, she leaned closer to him, laughing at something I couldn't hear over the music. At that point, I started noticing how isolated I felt. It wasn't just that Stephanie seemed absorbed in her own little world with Ryan, it was how little effort she made to include me in it. It was as if I wasn't even there, just an afterthought at a party where I was supposed to feel like her partner, her equal. Instead, I felt like a shadow, lurking in the background while she soaked up someone else's attention. The worst part wasn't even the obvious chemistry between them. It was the subtle ways she shut me out. I'd see her whisper something to Alice, glancing in my direction, and then both of them would laugh quietly. I'd walk toward her group, hoping to join in on the conversation, but the moment she saw me, her demeanor would shift, stiffening slightly, her smile more forced. It was as though my presence disrupted whatever dynamic she had with Ryan, and she didn't want me there ruining it. I stayed on the sidelines for as long as I could, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was letting my insecurities get the better of me. But then, Stephanie and Ryan started to disappear for longer stretches of time. I'd look around the room and realize they weren't there. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe they'd stepped outside for air or wandered into the kitchen. But each time they vanished, it felt like they were gone a little longer. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore. I started making excuses to move around the house, pretending I was looking for someone or getting a drink, but really, I was searching for them. In the back of my mind, I kept telling myself I wouldn't find anything, That I'd walk into a room and see them chatting harmlessly, nothing out of the ordinary. But with every empty room I passed, every corner I turned to find no sign of them, my chest tightened. I ended up in the hallway near the guest bathroom, pausing to catch my breath. My thoughts were racing, spinning into worst-case scenarios I didn't want to believe. I leaned against the wall, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. She wouldn't do this. She couldn't. This was Stephanie, my wife. The woman I'd built a life with. The woman who promised me forever. But then I heard laughter, hers, unmistakable, softer than usual, almost like a giggle. It came from down the hall, faint but clear enough to make my stomach drop. I froze for a moment, unsure whether to follow the sound or turn around and leave before I saw something I couldn't unsee. But the laughter came again, this time joined by Ryan's voice, low and murmured, and something inside me snapped. I didn't even realize I'd started walking until I was halfway down the hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. The laughter stopped abruptly, and for a second, I thought maybe they'd heard me coming. But as I reached the slightly ajar door at the end of the hall, I realized they hadn't. They were too absorbed in whatever they were doing to notice anything else. I couldn't see much through the crack in the door, just a sliver of movement, the edge of Ryan's arm as he leaned closer to someone. But it was enough to confirm what I'd been dreading all night. They weren't just talking. They weren't just laughing. Whatever was happening in that room, it wasn't innocent. And suddenly, every suspicion, every uneasy feeling I'd been trying to suppress, came rushing to the surface, suffocating me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Part of me wanted to burst through the door and confront them on the spot, to demand answers, to make them explain what the hell was going on. But another part of me, the part that felt like a scared, powerless fool, couldn't bring itself to face the truth. Eventually, I turned and walked away, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't deal with this here, not surrounded by strangers, not in a house that wasn't even mine. But as I made my way back toward the main party, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever I'd just seen, or almost seen, was about to change everything. The moment I turned away from the door, the rest of the party became a blur. Faces, voices, laughter, it all felt distant, like I was watching it from behind glass. My mind was racing, replaying every interaction I'd seen between Stephanie and Ryan that night, every subtle touch, every shared glance. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. I wandered back into the living room, hoping for something, anything, that would distract me from the growing knot in my stomach. But it didn't help. Stephanie and Ryan were still nowhere to be found. Alice caught my eye, and for a moment, I thought about asking her if she'd seen them, but the words got stuck in my throat. What could I even say? What excuse could I make for needing to know where my wife was, for the way my hands were trembling? I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe they were just talking somewhere quiet. Maybe I was reading too much into this. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about the way Stephanie had acted tonight that was different. Something I couldn't explain away no matter how hard I tried. The unease twisted into something sharper, something closer to dread, as I started searching again. This time, I wasn't subtle about it. I moved from room to room, ignoring the curious looks from the other guests. I must have looked desperate, maybe even unhinged, but I didn't care. I needed to find her. I needed to know. It was in the back corner of the house, past a closed door that I hadn't noticed before. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of a lamp spilling through the thin gap beneath the door. I could hear muffled voices, low and indistinct, but I recognized Stephanie's tone immediately. She wasn't laughing this time. Her voice was softer, almost pleading, and though I couldn't make out the words, I could hear the intimacy in them. My stomach churned as I stood frozen in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. But the not knowing was worse than anything I could imagine. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pushed the door open. The scene inside hit me like a punch to the gut. Stephanie was perched on the edge of a couch, her hair slightly disheveled, her face flushed. Ryan was sitting next to her, his arm resting casually along the back of the couch, far too close. They both froze when they saw me, their faces mirroring the same look of startled guilt. Stephanie shot to her feet, smoothing her dress, while Ryan stayed seated, his expression shifting into something smug, almost defiant. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched out, thick and unbearable, as I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. Stephanie's lips parted like she was about to say something, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted to Ryan, then back to me, and that was all it took for the last shred of doubt in my mind to shatter. I didn't need her to explain. I didn't need to hear whatever excuse or lie she was about to come up with. The truth was written all over her face, in the way she couldn't meet my gaze, in the way her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. Ryan, on the other hand, didn't seem the least bit remorseful. He leaned back against the couch, his posture relaxed, like he wasn't the least bit concerned about the destruction he'd just caused. The corner of his mouth twitched into the faintest hint of a smirk, and I had to clench my fists to keep from doing something I'd regret. Stephanie finally found her voice, stumbling over a string of half-formed sentences that barely qualified as an explanation. She tried to downplay it, calling it a misunderstanding, saying nothing had happened, but her words rang hollow. Her voice trembled with the kind of desperation that only comes from being caught red-handed, and it made me sick. I couldn't listen to her anymore. I turned and walked out, ignoring the sound of her voice calling after me. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow, and I leaned against the side of the house, struggling to keep myself together. A few minutes later, Stephanie found me. She looked panicked, her cheeks streaked with tears. She tried to reach for me, to touch my arm, but I pulled away. She started pleading, insisting it wasn't what it looked like, that I had it all wrong, but her words only made me angrier. How could she stand there and lie to my face after everything I'd just seen? I told her I didn't want to hear it, my voice low and cold in a way that startled even me. She flinched, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt, to soften the edges of my words. Whatever fragile bond had held our marriage together was snapping, piece by piece, and I could feel the weight of it crushing me. The ride home was unbearable. She tried again and again to explain, her voice wavering as she searched for the right words to fix this, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. By the time we pulled into the driveway, her tears had turned into silence, and the house felt colder than it ever had. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Stephanie cried softly beside me. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. I didn't reach for her hand or try to reassure her that things would be okay. Because they wouldn't. I wasn't sure they ever could be again. The next morning, the house was filled with an uncomfortable, suffocating silence. Stephanie had gotten up before me, probably trying to avoid the inevitable conversation. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the faint patterns on the ceiling, replaying the events of the night before. It was like watching a nightmare unfold over and over, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the sickening weight in my chest wouldn't go away. When I finally got up, I found her in the kitchen, her back to me as she poured coffee. The tension in her posture was unmistakable, her shoulders stiff, her movements jerky. She must have heard me come in, but she didn't turn around. She just stood there, holding the mug, staring out the window like she could pretend none of this had happened. I didn't give her the chance to ignore it. I asked her to sit down, keeping my tone steady, even though everything inside me was threatening to boil over. She hesitated, clinging to that mug like it was the only thing anchoring her. Then she turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She looked fragile, like she was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces, but I couldn't let that sway me. Not now. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, fiddling with the mug, avoiding eye contact. I told her I needed answers, and she started to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. What came out of her mouth was a mess of contradictions. She claimed nothing had happened between her and Ryan, that they'd only been talking. She insisted I'd misinterpreted what I saw, that it was all innocent. But her words didn't match her tone, and the nervous tremor in her voice told a different story. I pressed her, refusing to let her brush it off. I needed her to admit it, to say out loud what I already knew in my gut. That's when she shifted tactics. She said she had too much to drink, that she wasn't thinking clearly, and that Ryan had been the one making moves on her. She tried to twist the narrative, painting herself as the victim of his advances, but it didn't add up. Not with the way she'd been acting all night. Not with the look on her face when I found them. I told her I didn't believe her, and that's when she snapped. She accused me of being paranoid, of always jumping to the worst conclusions. She said I'd been smothering her lately, that my jealousy was pushing her away. It was like she was trying to turn the blame onto me, as if her actions were somehow my fault. The audacity of it left me speechless. She leaned into the argument, her words coming faster, her voice rising. She accused me of never trusting her, of being too controlling. She said she felt like she couldn't breathe around me, like I was always watching, waiting for her to slip up. It was a barrage of accusations, each one hitting harder than the last, and I could feel my resolve wavering. Was she trying to gaslight me? Or was I really as suffocating as she claimed? But then I remembered the way she'd looked at Ryan. The way she'd laughed with him, leaned into him, disappeared with him. I remembered the guilt in her eyes when I found them together. That wasn't on me. That was her choice. When she realized her deflections weren't working, her tone changed again. She broke down, the tears streaming freely now as she begged me to believe her. She swore it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. She said she'd never wanted to hurt me, that she loved me, that I was the only one she cared about. Her words were desperate, frantic, but they felt hollow. How could she claim to love me while doing something like this? I felt torn. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that this could be salvaged, that we could somehow move past this. But another part of me, the part that had watched her lie to my face over and over, knew better. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was a betrayal, and no amount of tears or pleading could erase that. The rest of the day passed in a haze. She tried to act normal, going through the motions of daily life, but the cracks were impossible to ignore. Every time she looked at me, there was a flicker of fear in her eyes, like she was waiting for me to explode. But I didn't. I stayed calm, detached, letting the weight of her actions sink in fully before I decided what to do next. That night, I couldn't even bring myself to share the same bed with her. I slept on the couch, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of her crying in the bedroom. I felt numb, like a part of me had shut down completely. The thought of confronting this head-on again felt unbearable, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The next morning, I started digging. Not physically, but in the ways that mattered. I scrolled through her social media, her messages, looking for anything that might confirm what I already suspected. At first, there was nothing. She'd been careful, deleting conversations, covering her tracks. But then I found it. A single message from Ryan, buried in her archived chats, that she must have forgotten to erase. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. His tone, the way he talked about their connection, the way he implied they'd shared something special, it was enough. Enough to confirm that this wasn't just some drunken misunderstanding. Enough to prove that whatever line they'd crossed, it wasn't a one-time thing. I confronted her with it later that evening, laying the evidence in front of her and watching as the color drained from her face. She tried to deny it at first, her voice shaky and defensive, but when I didn't back down, she finally broke. She admitted they'd been talking for months, that it had started as innocent flirting but had escalated into something more. She swore they hadn't gone all the way, but I didn't believe her. How could I? Her lies had been exposed, and the reality of what she'd done was staring both of us in the face. I told her I needed time to think, that I couldn't even look at her right now. She begged me not to give up on us, but her words felt like noise, meaningless and insincere. I walked out of the house, needing space, needing air. As I sat alone in the car, staring at the darkened street, one thought kept echoing in my mind. This wasn't just the end of a fight. This was the beginning of the end of us. The days that followed were a blur of anger, heartbreak, and confusion. Stephanie alternated between avoiding me completely and bombarding me with desperate attempts to talk. She wanted to explain, to justify, to rewrite the story in a way that might make me forgive her. But no matter what version she tried to spin, the reality of her betrayal remained the same. The house felt like a war zone. The tension hung thick in the air, suffocating us both. Every interaction was laced with resentment, hers masked with fragile hope, mine sharp and cutting. I could barely look at her without replaying the moment I found her with Ryan, the shame and guilt etched on her face, the casual arrogance of the man who thought nothing of the damage he'd caused. It wasn't long before cracks began to show in Stephanie's version of events. Her stories didn't line up. Details shifted, excuses unraveled, and the truth bled through the lies like ink seeping through paper. She still insisted nothing physical had happened between them, but the more she talked, the more obvious it became that there was more to the story than she was admitting. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, real answers, not the half-truths and denials she kept feeding me. So I reached out to Alice. She'd been close with Stephanie for years, her best friend since college. If anyone knew what had been going on, it was her. When I called, Alice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. She agreed to meet me but made it clear she didn't want to be caught in the middle of this. I didn't blame her. Still, when we sat down in the corner of a quiet cafe, her expression told me she knew more than she was letting on. At first, Alice tried to brush it off, saying she didn't want to get involved. But as I pressed her, her resolve started to crack. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup, before finally admitting she'd noticed something was off. She said Ryan had always been flirty, a little too comfortable crossing boundaries, and Stephanie had seemed receptive. I asked her point-blank if she thought there was more going on, and she sighed, avoiding my gaze. That's when she told me she'd seen them together before, not just at the party, but on other occasions. She said she hadn't wanted to jump to conclusions, but looking back, it was obvious something had been brewing between them for a while. Hearing it from Alice felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the fact that other people had noticed that I'd been the last to see it. It made me feel small, humiliated, like a fool who'd been played for months. When I got home, Stephanie was waiting for me, perched nervously on the couch like she knew I'd learned something new. I didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from her and let the silence stretch. She looked anxious, her hands fidgeting in her lap, her eyes darting to mine and then away. I told her I'd spoken to Alice. The color drained from her face, and she immediately started talking, her words spilling out in a frantic rush. She claimed Alice had misunderstood, that there was nothing going on, that it was all just a big miscommunication. But the panic in her voice told me otherwise. She wasn't defending herself, she was grasping at straws, trying to keep her crumbling story intact. I asked her again, calmly, deliberately, how long it had been going on. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right lie. But then, finally, she broke. She admitted they'd been talking for months, meeting up occasionally when she told me she was working late or running errands. She swore it was just emotional, that it hadn't crossed into anything physical, but her hesitation made it clear she wasn't telling the whole truth. I told her I didn't believe her, and she snapped, her tone shifting from pleading to defensive. She accused me of never trusting her, of always assuming the worst. She said I'd pushed her to this, that my insecurities had made her feel trapped. It was the same argument she'd used before, but now it sounded desperate, hollow. The final blow came the next day. While Stephanie was out, I dug deeper, scrolling through her email, her messages, anything that might give me the answers she refused to provide. That's when I found it, an old chain of messages between her and Ryan, hidden in an archive folder. The messages were explicit, leaving no room for doubt. They talked about sneaking away together, about stolen moments and close calls. He joked about how risky it was, and she responded with playful teasing, as though the thrill of their affair was more exciting than the damage it was causing. Reading their words felt like being gutted. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way she talked about it, the casual disregard for what we had built together. She didn't just betray me, she made a mockery of our marriage, of the trust one had placed in her. When she got home that evening, I showed her the messages. She broke down completely, collapsing into tears, begging me to forgive her. She claimed it had been a mistake, that she hadn't meant for it to go this far, that she still loved me and wanted to fix things. But her apologies felt empty, like they were more about saving herself than making amends. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't make any decisions while I was still this angry. She tried to stop me, grabbing my arm, pleading with me to stay, but I pulled away. I couldn't look at her, couldn't be near her. I needed space to think, to figure out what I was going to do. That night, I stayed with Damon. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He just poured me a drink and let me sit in silence. When I finally told him what had happened, he listened quietly, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When I finished, he looked at me with a kind of calm, steady gaze that only a true friend could offer and told me the truth I already knew. This wasn't something I could come back from. And deep down, I knew he was right. The following days were nothing short of chaos. Stephanie grew frantic in her attempts to salvage what was left of our marriage, but her desperation only pushed me further away. She alternated between begging for forgiveness and lashing out at me, accusing me of being cold and unrelenting. Each time I tried to retreat into my thoughts, to find some clarity, she would corner me, crying, pleading, promising that she could fix this if I'd only give her the chance. Her mood swings were exhausting. One moment, she was trying to paint herself as a victim, claiming Ryan had pursued her relentlessly, that she'd been caught in a moment of weakness, that it wasn't really her fault. The next, she was blaming me, saying I hadn't been emotionally present, that I hadn't paid enough attention to her, that I'd driven her into Ryan's arms without realizing it. I couldn't decide which version of her was worse, the remorseful liar or the bitter manipulator. It was clear that she was unraveling, and frankly, I wasn't far behind. My mind raced constantly, bouncing between anger, heartbreak, and sheer disbelief. How had we ended up here? How had the woman I'd trusted with everything, the woman I'd built a life with, turned into someone I could barely recognize? Things came to a head when I decided to confront Ryan directly. I'd spent enough time piecing together the fragments of Stephanie's lies. Now, I needed to hear it from the man who'd played a role in tearing my life apart. I wasn't looking for an apology. I didn't expect remorse from someone like him. I just wanted the truth, no matter how ugly it was. I met him at a bar after tracking him down through Alice. She didn't want to tell me where he worked, but eventually relented after realizing I wasn't going to stop until I got answers. Ryan looked smug when he saw me, like he knew exactly why I was there and relished the power he held in the situation. His casual arrogance made my blood boil. I kept my voice calm, though every fiber of my being wanted to grab him by the collar and force the answers out of him. I told him I knew about the affair and demanded he tell me how long it had been going on and exactly what had happened. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink lazily, clearly enjoying the moment. Ryan didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost proud as he admitted they'd been seeing each other for months. He didn't bother sugarcoating it or pretending to regret anything. Instead, he smirked as he described how easy it had been to win Stephanie over, how she'd confided in him about her frustrations with our marriage, how she'd been looking for something more exciting. Hearing him talk about her so casually, like she was just another conquest, made me sick. But what hit me the hardest was the way he spoke about me, like I was some clueless fool he'd outsmarted, like I was irrelevant to the equation. He didn't even try to hide his disdain, calling me a nice guy who didn't know how to keep his wife happy. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay seated. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I let him talk, each word chipping away at whatever hope I'd been holding on to. By the time I left, I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. When I got home, Stephanie was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She must have guessed where I'd gone, because the moment I walked in, she started crying again. She asked me what Ryan had said, but I didn't answer. I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the person Ryan had described. For the first time, I truly saw her for what she was. Not the woman I'd fallen in love with, not the partner I'd shared my life with, but someone selfish, deceitful, and willing to destroy everything we'd built for a fleeting thrill. It was like a switch had flipped in my mind. I couldn't do this anymore. I told her it was over. The words came out steady, firm, without hesitation. She begged me to reconsider, swearing she'd do anything to make things right. She promised to cut off all contact with Ryan, to go to counseling, to rebuild the trust she'd broken. But it was too late. Whatever we'd had was gone, shattered beyond repair. Her pleading turned to anger as she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. She accused me of giving up too easily, of being unforgiving, of not fighting for our marriage. I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. I packed a bag that night and left, staying at Damon's house for the time being. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to remind me that I wasn't completely alone in this. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done letting Stephanie's lies dictate my life. It was time to take control, to start over, no matter how painful it might be. The decision to file for divorce felt like stepping off a cliff. Even though I knew there was no other choice, it didn't make it any easier. I spent hours going over the memories of our life together, trying to pinpoint where it all started to go wrong. Was it something I did? Something I missed? A part of me wanted to blame myself, but the reality was clearer now than ever. This wasn't my failure. It was hers. The first thing I did after calling the lawyer was inform Stephanie. I wanted her to hear it from me before the papers arrived. When I went back to the house that evening, it was like stepping into enemy territory. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear her pacing in the living room before I even walked through the door. When I told her I was filing, her reaction was immediate and explosive. She screamed, sobbed, accused me of being heartless, of not giving her a chance to fix things. She begged me to think about everything we'd been through, everything we had. But her tears didn't move me anymore. I stood there, emotionless, as she hurled every excuse, every justification she could muster. She even tried to guilt me, saying I was throwing away our marriage over a mistake. A mistake. That's what she kept calling it, as if her months-long affair with Ryan could be chalked up to a single bad decision. It was infuriating, but I refused to engage. She wanted me to argue, to get emotional, to give her something she could latch onto and twist back at me. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I told her the truth as plainly as I could. The trust was gone. I told her I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if she was lying to me, wondering if she'd find another Ryan the next time she got bored or frustrated. I told her I deserved better than this, better than her, and that was when the fight left her. She crumpled into the couch, sobbing quietly, and for the first time, I didn't feel pity for her. Leaving the house for good was harder than I expected. Not because of her, but because of the memories. I packed my things methodically, trying not to let my mind wander to all the happy moments we'd shared here. This house had been our home, the place where we'd celebrated milestones, laughed over silly arguments, and made plans for the future. Now, it felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of what could have been. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the life we'd built together. It was strange, starting over in a place that didn't feel like home, surrounded by unfamiliar walls. But it also felt freeing. For the first time in months, I didn't have to deal with Stephanie's lies, her excuses, her presence looming over me like a storm cloud. Damon was my rock during those first few weeks. He checked in constantly, dragging me out of the apartment when I started to isolate myself, reminding me that life didn't end here. He listened patiently as I vented, offering advice only when I asked for it. He never told me to get over it or move on. He just let me feel what I needed to feel, and that was exactly what I needed. Stephanie, meanwhile, didn't let go so easily. She bombarded me with texts and calls, alternating between apologies and accusations. One day, she'd beg me to come home, promising to be better, to rebuild what we'd lost. The next, she'd lash out, blaming me for ruining everything, for giving up on her. I ignored most of her messages, only responding when it was absolutely necessary. Eventually, she started playing dirty. She tried to rope Alice into her schemes, hoping her best friend could convince me to change my mind. Alice called me one evening, clearly torn, and said Stephanie had been asking her to mediate. I told Alice I wasn't interested in mediation. This wasn't something we could fix with a few heartfelt conversations and empty promises. Stephanie also tried to bring up my coldness as a reason for the divorce. She told mutual friends I'd been distant for years, that I hadn't appreciated her, that I'd driven her to Ryan. Hearing that stung more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't true, of course. I'd given everything to our marriage, and she knew it. But hearing her rewrite the narrative to make herself the victim was like a second betrayal. What hurt even more was how some people believed her. A few friends reached out, cautiously asking if I was okay but clearly suspicious of my version of events. I didn't bother defending myself to them. If they couldn't see through her lies, they weren't worth my time. The lawyer I hired was sharp and efficient, cutting through the mess with the precision of a scalpel. I made it clear that I wanted the process to be as quick and clean as possible. I didn't care about dividing up the material things. I just wanted it done. Stephanie, predictably, tried to drag it out, insisting she deserved more than half because she'd sacrificed so much for our marriage. I let the lawyers handle that fight. By the time the divorce papers were finalized, I felt more relief than anything else. It wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like I'd won. It felt like walking away from a burning building, scarred but alive. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. Slowly, cautiously, I started piecing together a life that didn't revolve around her. I reconnected with old friends, threw myself into work, and started therapy at Damon's suggestion. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness hit like a wave, pulling me under, but it was progress. The pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. I knew I'd carry the scars of this betrayal for a long time, maybe forever. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Like I had a chance to find peace. After the divorce was finalized, I expected to feel some kind of closure, like flipping a switch to shut off the pain. But it didn't work that way. The end of the marriage wasn't the end of the hurt. It was just the beginning of the healing. It was as though I had finally stopped the bleeding, but the wound was still raw, and it would take time to fully heal. Stephanie didn't make it easy. Even after the papers were signed, she kept finding ways to reach out. Some days it was a text, saying she missed me or asking if we could meet for coffee to talk. Other days, it was a long email filled with half-hearted apologies and excuses, asking if I'd reconsider. I didn't respond to most of them. The few times I did, it was out of necessity, and my replies were curt, to the point, and without emotion. One day, she showed up unannounced at my apartment. I wasn't surprised, but I was angry. She stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, saying she didn't know how to move on, that she still loved me, that she couldn't picture her life without me. But the person in front of me wasn't the woman I'd loved. That woman had made her choices, burned the bridge between us, and left me to pick up the pieces. I told her as much. Calmly, firmly, without anger. I told her that I didn't hate her, but I couldn't forgive her, and I certainly couldn't give her another chance. Whatever she'd felt during her affair, excitement, freedom, validation, had cost her everything, and she needed to live with that. I told her that I needed to move on and that it was time she did the same. She left that day, and for the first time, she didn't try to contact me again. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to fill the empty hours. I went to the gym regularly, not just to stay fit but to burn off the restless energy that seemed to bubble up every time I thought about the betrayal. I spent more time with Damon, who continued to be my anchor, pulling me back whenever the tide of anger and sadness threatened to overwhelm me. Therapy became a lifeline. At first, I wasn't sure it would help. I didn't like talking about my feelings. It made me feel vulnerable, exposed. But my therapist didn't push me. She let me open up at my own pace, and over time, I found myself sharing more than I ever thought I would. I talked about the marriage, about the betrayal, about the ways I'd questioned myself and my worth. One day, she asked me a question that stuck with me. What do you want your life to look like now? The question hit me harder than I expected. I realized I hadn't thought about the future at all. I'd been so focused on surviving, on getting through the pain, that I hadn't considered what came next. 4 years, my life had been built around Stephanie and our marriage. Now, I had a blank slate, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel terrifying. It felt liberating. I started making changes. Small ones at first, redecorating the apartment, picking up hobbies I'd put aside during the marriage. I rediscovered my love for cooking, spending hours experimenting with recipes in the tiny kitchen of my new place. I started running again, something I hadn't done since college, and I found that the rhythm of my feet pounding the pavement helped quiet the noise in my head. Damon convinced me to go out more, and though I resisted at first, I eventually started joining him for happy hours and social events. It felt strange, being single again, navigating a world that I hadn't been part of in years. But it also felt good, like I was reclaiming a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. Slowly, I started meeting new people. I wasn't ready for anything serious, not yet, but I began to enjoy the idea of companionship again. There were moments when I caught myself smiling, laughing, even flirting, and I realized I hadn't felt that light in years. One night, Damon and I sat on the balcony of his apartment, beers in hand, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He asked me if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about everything I'd been through, the pain, the anger, the nights spent questioning everything about myself and my choices. Then I thought about where I was now, the peace I felt when I ran, the satisfaction of mastering a new recipe, the spark of joy in connecting with someone new. I told him I wasn't sure if I was happy yet, but I was getting there. The truth is, moving on isn't a single moment or decision. It's a series of steps, some small, some big, each one bringing you closer to the life you want. There are still days when the past creeps in, when the weight of what happened feels heavier than usual. But those days are becoming fewer and farther between. I've started to feel like myself again, or maybe like someone new. Someone stronger, wiser, and more aware of what I deserve. Stephanie's betrayal will always be a part of my story, but it's not the whole story. For the first time in what feels like forever, I'm hopeful. Not just for the future, but for myself. And that, I think, is the best kind of beginning.